Hi everybody. Today we're going to go over Kantian ethics and product design. Sometimes Kantian ethics is referred to as deontology um, because Kantian ethics is really a subset of deontology. The last theory we went over was utilitarianism, and before that we did social contract theory and the law. Um, so just a reminder, utilitarianism is when you try to maximize the happiness and minimize the unhappiness for the group as best you can. Um, a key drawback to utilitarianism is that if taken to the extremes could lead to awful outcomes for some people. Um, there have been plenty of cases in history where somebody in power will say, I'm doing what's best for everybody by discounting one demographic of people. Um, and this leads to awful outcomes. Deontology, or Kantian ethics, when used with utilitarianism, limits the bad outcomes. If you remember when I talked about utilitarianism, I mentioned there was one variant where it had shorter outlooks on how things were going to go, and another one that followed a basic set of rules. Kantian ethics is where those basic set of rules tend to come from. Engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So let's start with some history. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher. He established a comprehensive system of ethics that we now know as Kantian ethics. Um, his attitude was you should be duty driven in life, and so his ethics system is duty based. That is to say, you ought to behave a particular way because you have duties that you must fulfill. Um, and these duties should guide your reasoning. He emphasized that moral decisions should be motivated by a sense of duty. For engineers, you could call this a sense of logic. Like any ethical theory, Kantianism is not without its limitations and fallibilities, which I will go over in today's class. So these are the fundamental principles of Kantian ethics. Moral actions are guided by categorical imperatives, which are absolute and universal moral commands. Imperative 1, the principle of universalizability. Act only according to the maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Imperative 2, principle of humanity. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Imperative 3, principle of autonomy. Thus, the third practical principle follows from the first two as the ultimate condition of their harmony with practical reasoning. The idea of the will of every rational being as a universally legislating will. Alright, so that was a mouthful. I'm not particularly fond of a lot of Kant's writings, not because he has bad ideas, but because of the way he communicates what he's trying to say. He was German, and a very German thing to do is to take something that only needs 5 words to explain and using 1,000. And so all of his explanations tend to be kind of wordy, requiring to give actual examples, but because of how wordy his explanation is, the examples are never 100%. So, principle of universalizability. An action is morally acceptable if the moral principle underlying it can be willed as universal law without contradiction. What does that mean? So I take this as the golden rule. Um, if you don't want them doing it to you, you shouldn't be doing it to them. Mm. And it gets really simplistic. So if you wanted to lie to somebody, if someone is considering lying to achieve personal gain, they should apply the principle of universalizability. They need to ask themselves whether they can will lying to be a universal law that everyone should follow. That is to say, if you're allowed to lie, then they should also be allowed to lie. And would you want them lying to you? And if the answer is no, then you shouldn't be lying to them. If lying were universalized, trust and communication would break down, rendering the act of lying self-defeating and contradictory. Principle 2. Um, Individuals should be treated as ends in of themselves, not merely as a means to an end. This means that you need to recognize the capacity for their rationality, freedom of choice, moral agency. You must acknowledge their rights, desires, and aspirations. Must refrain from using them solely as an instrument to achieve your own goals or purposes. Generally speaking, this principle opposes any form of exploitation, manipulation, or objectification of a human being. So this doesn't mean you can't use people. It just means that when you are using somebody, they need to be consenting to it. And an example would be when you go to a store. If you go get food in the mess hall in Facatelli, the person behind the counter is being used by you to get you your coffee, your bagel, whatever have you want to buy. But they're doing it in exchange. You're using them for the food, and they're using you for money. And they know, and they're aware of it. And by being transparent about it, you're not dehumanizing them. However, if you were to use them under false pretenses or just in general objectify them, you're using them in such a way that dehumanizes them. Um, Literally, when you objectify somebody, you're treating them like an object and not a human. The last is the third principle of, and this is the principle of autonomy. Individuals have the right to make their own decisions and determine their own actions, when they do not infringe upon the rights and autonomy of others. It's immoral to dictate others' values, desires, and beliefs. You're responsible for your own actions. Autonomy does not imply absolute freedom without any ethical considerations, but rather it encourages individuals to act responsibly and consider the moral implications of their choices. So a few classes back, I criticized people who claim or state that they're altruistic. And one of the reasons is it's very common for altruists to be kind of bossy. Altruists, the technical term is paternalistic. They're acting like a parent telling you how to behave. Um, and by definition, if you behave that way, you are removing the autonomy of others, and to a certain extent, you're dehumanizing them. So I'm always skeptical of people who are altruists because they tend to also be non-Kantian, which, as you'll see in a few minutes, probably would make them not an altruist. Further, when you look at this principle, this tends to be one of the big things libertarians talk about. In a lot of engineering scenarios you're going to run into, you kind of have to let contractors and manufacturers make their own decisions. You can give them end goals, specifications, quantities, things like that, but you have to let them use their own autonomy to get work done. And when you have employees, it's the same case. If somebody doesn't have full autonomy at work, either because you're micromanaging them or you're being micromanaged, you're not going to want to be there. And so when you think about why you don't like people taking away your autonomy, it's because you feel dehumanized. Um, and so this is a very important principle. Morality based on Kantian ethics. Kantian ethics emphasizes that morality is not solely based on personal desire, self-interest, or pursuit of happiness. Instead, it centers on a sense of duty and the adherence of moral principles. In the context of engineering, this means that engineers have a moral obligation to act in accordance with their professional responsibilities and uphold ethical standards. Engineers bear a significant moral duty to prioritize the safety, well-being, and welfare of the public. This involves ensuring that the engineering projects are designed, implemented, and maintained in a manner that minimizes risks, prevents harm, and promotes the overall benefit of society. This duty extends beyond immediate stakeholders to consider the long-term consequences of engineering decisions in future generations. Kantian ethics urges engineers to consider the impact of their projects on the stakeholders involved. This includes investors, consumers, the public, and other affected parties. Engineers should strive to engage in meaningful consultation with these stakeholders, listen to their concerns, and seek their informed consent when implementing projects that have the potential to impact communities. Ethical decision making. Kantian ethics encourages the engineer to engage in ethical decision-making processes that prioritize moral duties and principles. This involves assessing the potential consequences of engineering actions, evaluating them in light of universal morals, and ensuring that decisions align with principles of respect, autonomy, human dignity, and justice. So I presented this to you guys first or second class. I'll just reiterate it. So you work at a factory, it's a pharmaceutical plant. The FDA has recently performed the 24-month audit. They found several easily addressable issues that you need to fix. You haven't passed the FDA's inspection, but once you address the issues, you will. This is normal. For unrelated reasons, the owner wants to retire by liquidating the assets in the factory and firing the staff. An investor who is new to pharmaceuticals is interested in purchasing the factory and keeping it running instead. They're unfamiliar with the FDA's processes and assume that bringing a factory from failing to passing is a long, expensive process. Do you? You know, if you spend too much time discussing the issue with the investor, they'll get nervous and move on to another facility that has already passed. You know this is the most profitable option for the investor. You know the owner will liquidate the factory, and you know by the time the investor is in charge, you will have passed the FDA's inspection. Do you lie and say you passed? Well, what would a utilitarian say? Assume that the factory has more than 10 people working at it. What in this scenario causes the most happiness and the least sadness? What decision? If you feel guilty about lying, how much guilt do you feel you actually have compared to the sadness and stress and anxiety of the other employees who don't know how they'll feed their kids? Once you've answered that, I want you to ask yourself, what would a Kantian say? Somebody who practices duty-based ethics, deontology. How would they say? What would they say? Before you proceed, I'd like you to pause and answer. How would a utilitarian answer? What would a Kantian say? All right, so you've emailed me an answer. If you're a Kantian, If you're allowed to lie, then everyone is allowed to lie. If everyone is allowed to lie all the time, overall utility for the world will go down. Therefore, no one is allowed to lie. If you lie and something bad happens to you, if you lie and something bad happens, you become partially responsible. If you tell the truth, the owner, if you tell the truth, the owner becomes completely responsible for the situation. Now, at this point, a handful of people might not agree. You had an option to solve the problem. You chose to do nothing. But that's not how a Kantian would view it. So if you're going to respond as if you're a Kantian, these are acceptable answers. We as a team should provide the investor with all necessary information, including both positive and negative aspects of the situation. By doing so, you enable the investor to make an informed decision based on their own judgment and exercise their autonomy in determining whether to proceed with the investment. You are pro-utilitarian. As a faithful agent to the investor, and performing services only in areas of your expertise, we know the factory will be operational in a few weeks. We have a duty to our coworkers to ensure that they can keep food on the children's table. We, as a company, need to weigh the consequences of lying and telling the truth. If we keep the factory running and address the FDA issues, it would lead to greater benefit for a larger number of people, such as preserving jobs, maintaining availability of essential medications, and ensuring the well-being of the community. Then it is the morally preferable choice to lie to the investor. It's a thought experiment 2. Approved supplier lists. You need to keep your operating costs down. Recently, a piece of hardware that you need to work has stopped working. Supplier you're not currently using states they can fix it, but they'd be willing to repair it for you, and you'd only need to send supply contracts their way when you can. This is normal. Um, they're not really being altruistic here. It's a scratching each other's back kind of situation. However, you're a new employee, and you don't have a means of putting the supplier on the approved supplier list. Most companies, what this means is they send a third party to go audit the supplier to make sure that the supplier is a quality person to be working with and is reliable. They don't want locals making that decision because they'll just end up giving out contracts to their cousin. It'll be years before you have the authority to modify the list. That is to say, the higher ups in the company really won't listen to you until you've been there for a few years. The point of contact you're working with or dealing with will most likely have moved on by that time. So in 5 years or so, maybe you'll be able to update the approved supplier list, but the person you're currently dealing with, they'll have gone to another company by that time. There's a very short list of products that they sell that you'd be willing to buy. So even if you were, by means of magic, able to get them on that list, you're not going to buy a lot of stuff from them. Do you accept the free service? So I want you to pause. I want you to answer honestly. Do you think you'd take the free service? Now, there's two answers to this that are acceptable and still maintain Kantian ethics. The first is, no, you don't take it. You say, absolutely not, I'm not taking services from you, and you give them this information. The other option is you lead with this information. You say, look, I really need this free service, and I'll do my best to get you on the list, but I have this barrier in front of me preventing me from getting you on the list. At that point, if they still want to provide you the free service, you're not being immoral. you're being transparent. Why they would want to agree to this, I don't know, but that's the situation you'd be in. All right, thought experiment 3, dinner time. You and your family haven't eaten in several days. You find the opportunity where you can steal food without anyone noticing. Additionally, you know the food will most likely be thrown away. Do you steal the food? Pause, answer honestly. All right, so even in instances where it's not likely, it's known that the food is on its way to the trash, taking the food out and eating it would still be stealing. And so in this case, it would be considered immoral from a Kantian point of view. And so you would still need to ask if you could take the food, even if you're taking it out of the trash. Um, Kant argued that any action taken against another person to which he or she could not possibly have consented is a violation of perfect duty as interpreted through the second formulation. So you're dehumanizing. If a thief were to steal a book from an unknown victim, it may have been that the victim would have agreed had the thief simply asked. However, no person can consent to theft because the presence of consent would mean that the transfer was not a theft. Because the victim could not have consented to the action, it could not be instituted as a universal law of nature, and theft contradicts perfect duty. All right, this one's fun. You're having dinner with a family. A team of people has come to your door carrying guns, badges, and handcuffs. They say they're bounty hunters and hand you a picture of someone that looks like your brother, Bob. Upon a detailed inspection, you can tell the difference in the photo, but most people won't be able to tell the difference. Additionally, the hunters state they're looking for Andy. It becomes clear the hunter is only looking to get the reward. They're aware this is a case of mistaken identity and will turn Bob in even knowing it's a mistaken identity. They ask if anyone who looks like Andy is currently in the house. You know they'll leave if you lie and say it's just you. Do you lie? Pause. I want you to answer honestly. All right. So in this case, I would lie. But Kantian ethics would say you shouldn't. And the reason you shouldn't is because you're lying. You should never lie. He goes a step further in saying, in the event that something bad happened in the house, let's say the house burns down. Had you told the truth, Bob wouldn't have been in the house, and Bob would have survived. But if you lie and then the house burns down and Bob doesn't survive, you're guilty of his death. And the fact that the bounty hunter is clearly doing something illegal is irrelevant, according to Kant. So there are some critiques and limitations. So utilitarianism places significant emphasis on the consequences or outcomes of actions. If a situation involves maximizing overall happiness or minimizing overall harm, and the consequences are of utmost importance, utilitarianism may be prioritized over Kantianism, which focuses more on moral duty and principle. Kantian ethics emphasizes moral duties and principles that are absolute and universal. However, in situations where there are conflicting duties or principles that may be necessary to consider the overall consequences and weigh the trade-offs. Utilitarianism provides a framework for evaluating the overall consequences and making decisions that maximize the overall well-being, even if it means deviating from strict adherence to Kantian principles. Resolving complex moral dilemmas, some ethical dilemmas involve complex trade-offs and competing moral considerations. In such cases, utilitarianism may provide a more practical approach for weighing the overall benefits and harms, considering the interests and welfares of all parties involved. Kantian ethics, on the other hand, may provide more rigid guidelines based on moral duties and principles, but might not offer much flexibility in navigating complex ethical dilemmas. All right, so we're going to discuss the pulverizer. All right, this is a pulverizer. It's a mechanical device for grinding of many different types of materials. This is something you would put like, it's the thing they used in Fargo. You would put wood or something like that into here, and it would grind it up, and you'd get wood chips. This is the current model you're using. It has 7 horses. In 5 years, there have been 300 reported injuries. Discharge. So what's happening is the chute gets clogged, and the operator will remove the bag that covers the chute, and he'll try to unclog it. This will cause serious injury to their hands because there's rotating blades inside of it. So Fred, the mechanical engineer, needs to find a solution to this problem. All right, so problem, the chute has a tendency to clog. Machine is hard to restart. So this leads to people to run the machine without a bag. And they try to clear the clogs while the machine is running. All right, so is this a dilemma? Well, he has obligations to the company. First, he needs to keep the costs low. He doesn't have millions and millions of dollars to solve the problem. He has some money to solve the problem. He needs a rapid fix. So he needs to answer this problem like today. He needs to limit legal liability. He needs to keep consumer confidence. That is to say, the machine still needs to work as advertised. There's an obligation to the public. The product still needs to be safe. The product needs to work as advertised. It needs to meet user expectations. So, is this a dilemma? If he does nothing, is he in a good situation? No, probably not. He leaves everything unsafe, so he's violating that rule, so that's not a good situation. What else could he do? He could modify it, but that will change the cost schedule or technical performance, and that's also not good. So, yeah, I would consider this a dilemma. But Fred does have an ethical obligation both to the company and the public. How does he address this? All right, so what should Fred do? Well, first, who is Fred's moral audience? In this case, it would be his boss, the other engineers that he works with, the consumer, maybe the consumer's families. What real options does Fred have? He probably needs to make some kind of modification, right? What guidance might be helpful to Fred? At this point, these are the 3 real options, right? These are the 3 guiding principles we know. NSPE, utilitarianism, and Kantianism. So this is legal solution. Cover everything with signs. Do you think this is ethical? Email me your responses to what you think before you proceed. Engineers must consider the end user in designing hardware. Will the user of this product read the manual or the warning signs? If they do read the manual, will they be in the language the consumer will understand? Are the people using the product deaf to warnings? Every power tool I own says something to the effect of, "You will die" on it. Do you think I take those warnings seriously? Not really, because I know that they overdo it. I don't know if this is a genuine solution or if this is just legal doing the bare minimum to keep themselves out of trouble. So when you design a product, these are some of the things you want to keep in mind. You want to prioritize safety. In both utilitarianism and Kantianism, from a utilitarian perspective, ensuring user safety maximizes the overall well-being and minimizes harm. From a Kantian point of view, it's your moral duty to protect the well-being and safety of individuals, treat them as ends in of themselves rather than means to an end. So in the case of the Pinto, Ford was just using the consumer as a means to an end and not as an end in and of themselves. Next is you need to consider the needs and well-being of the consumer. Um, Again, with utilitarianism, this just maximizes the happiness, right? And satisfaction. So you want to design the product to give them the most satisfaction. Similarly, with Kantian perspective, you need to recognize and meet the needs of the user so that they may have autonomy when they're working. The next is sustainability and environmental impact. So when I say sustainable, and I'm not really particularly concerned about the environment, but you do want the solution to be sustainable. That is, to be something that they can keep doing. Yeah, some solutions are band-aid solutions, and you have to do them from time to time. But you need to minimize those, and you need to make sure that whatever design you're giving to somebody is something they're going to want to come back to regularly. And there's an actual um, a game theory economics reason for this. If somebody keeps using the same tool and they like using the same tool, they're going to tell their friends to also use that tool, and they're going to want to buy the tool. So you want to make it sustainable so they keep wanting to use it. Um, Now, by doing this, if you do a good job of making something sustainable, you will inherently, or the tendency is, you will also make it environmentally friendly because you minimize the work that needs to go into it, which in turn minimizes the waste. You want to make sure that the supply chain is ethical. This one's a bit harder, I understand, um, but we do live in a day and age where people kind of know what they're buying and from who and where it's coming from. A lot of consumers, or more accurately, spokesmen, will refuse to be associated with certain brands because they don't think that the brand is ethically sourced. A good example is shoes. A lot of big basketball players won't work with certain shoe companies because of the way that the shoes are manufactured. Some people refuse to shop at Walmart because they know the people working there aren't treated great. Next is accessibility and inclusivity. So you want everybody to be able to use your product. Naturally, this would just maximize the total number of end users. And from a utilitarian standpoint, if you have done everything correctly up to this point, that means you're making a good product and you want everybody to use it. And that'll, in turn, make your company more profitable. So you're making the investors happy, but you're also making consumers happy. So you're maximizing happiness in that way. From a Kantian point of view, um, you should be treating all individuals as ends in of themselves, ensuring that the product design is inclusive and do not discriminate against any user group. So obviously this is just an economic thing. You want everybody to use your product, but that attitude comes from both Kantian ethics and utilitarianism. You need to be transparent and honest in representation. You can't be deceitful. Being transparent and providing honest information about products corresponds to both utilitarianism and Kantianism. Utilitarianism values truthfulness and transparency as they contribute to informed decision making and overall well-being. Kantian ethics emphasizes the moral duty to be honest and treat others with respect, ensuring that the product representations are truthful and do not manipulate or deceive the consumer. And the last, social impact. Considering the broader social impact of the product alignment with both utilitarianism and Kantianism. Utilitarianism focuses on maximizing overall happiness and social welfare, so designing products that contribute positively to society and align with ethical principles supports this goal. Kantian ethics emphasizes the moral duty to act in a way that respects and promotes the well-being and dignity of individuals and society as a whole. All right, so we got to remember safety is paramount. So first you have to identify all possible hazards, and then you have to implement safety features to these hazards. You need to conduct a risk assessment. This allows you to do like a sanity check. Um, some hazards are so extreme that you don't even think about them. And you should really only focus on the ones that are either very likely or unlikely but have severe consequences. Go get user feedback. This is incredibly important and frustrating to deal with people. So I used to work on the production side, and I would get feedback from both the consumer and the manufacturer. And what was frustrating was the manufacturer would be able to identify what the consumer was going to say ahead of time. And they would say, this consumer is not going to want to use your product. You should change the way the product works. And what always ended up happening was the designer would insist we stay the course. Then it would get to the end user, and the end user would go back to the designer and say, WTF, why am I using this way? It doesn't work right. Now, in the situation I was in, the consumer and the designer were part of the same team technically, and so they had to work together. But in a professional environment, this conversation doesn't happen. They just go to a different vendor. And so you need to constantly be in contact with your customer base, asking them, do you like the product I'm giving? And if the answer is no, or if the answer is yes, but, you address it immediately. You make sure that that problem goes away from them as fast as physically possible. Yes, you need to make sure everything complies with regulations and standards. This includes considering guidelines provided by organizations such as OSHA or other regulatory bodies. Your instructions need to be clear. I love pictures because you don't need to translate pictures into French. What happens a lot is, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten crap instructions. And it's clear somebody took Chinese instructions and just translated them to English. And the instructions don't make any sense. And I can't tell you how often I've refused to use a product because the instructions were so poor. And usually it's indicative the overall product sucks. The warnings need to be meaningful and clear and understandable. The last is continuous improvement. Never look at your final product as an actual final product. Look at all of your final products as this quarter's, this year's final product, and plan to improve it moving forward. You need to make sure you are meeting the user's needs. That means you have to be user-centric. That means you have to be talking to the user. You have to make sure the product you're making is easy to use, ergonomic, meaning that they want to go back to it, keep using it. You want everyone to be able to use it. It needs to be durable and reliable. If it breaks every time you use it, they're not going to want to keep using your product. Make sure it's easy to maintain and support. All right. So you want to make sure it's sustainable, environmental. Um, so this means you want to reduce the amount of energy required to use it. You want to reduce the amount of waste. So this means you have to choose materials that are easily sourced and durable. You have to perform an actual life cycle assessment. Is this product going to sit on a shelf for years because the consumer is too lazy to throw it away? Is it going to become an eyesore that they don't want to have around anymore? If the answer is yes, you don't want to be selling this. If it's an eyesore that just sits on the wall, they're just going to be reminded of what not to buy next time. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure your supply chain's ethical. Look, if this were the 90s and nobody knew where anything was coming from, it wouldn't be a problem. But now it is. You have the internet. You can Google, where is my iPhone coming from? Who's making my iPhone? What are their work conditions? A lot of people have the wherewithal to know that most of their goods aren't made ethically, and by extension refuse to purchase from those companies. You want the product to be easy to use. You want it to be accessible and inclusive. So this means, say you're making a chainsaw, you want it to be light and easy to pick up. Um, you want it to be clear when something's about to become unsafe. You want to make sure that people who are difficulty hearing or trouble seeing don't have a big problem using it. You need to be transparent and honest. Look, just because you're trying to be honest, if you're not accurate, perceptions matter here, and you're going to be treated like you were lying. When you give information, it needs to be clear and understandable. You need to disclose all of the risks involved. You need to consider the social impact of what you're doing. Um, I realize at this point I'm kind of repeating myself, um, but if only one demographic of people can use your product, people will notice, and depending on how it gets executed, will choose to not use your product moving forward. So, what was the final decision? So, if you were in class, it would have taken time to discuss before proceeding. Um, but you can redesign the chute to prevent clogging. You can redesign the chute to prevent injury. You can provide a declogging tool. You can make the unit easier to start. You can add a mechanism that clears the blockage naturally. You can add safety guards. That is to say, if somebody starts to reach their hand in there, it automatically turns off. Add warning labels and revise the